thank you all for joining us. I'm very happy to see such a great turnout. It's my pleasure on behalf of Intellectual Property Partners and SBU's chapter of the National Academy of Inventors to welcome everybody to today's panel discussion titled From Ideas to Startups, Advice from Successful SBU Faculty Entrepreneurs. I'm Sean Boykovich, Director for Intellectual Property Partners here at Stony Brook University and Executive Director for Stony Brook's chapter of the National Academy of Inventors. Our office, Intellectual Property Partners, or IPP for short, was recently rebranded. Some of you may have known the office as the Office of Technology Licensing and Industry Relations. IPP is responsible for the management and licensing of intellectual property developed here at Stony Brook. Our mission is to bridge Stony Brook innovation with public benefit in partnership with SBU inventors and the business community. Cultivating and maintaining a strong partnerships with both industry and innovators at SBU is critical to achieving our mission. And to that end, our office is very interested in doing more to develop the community of innovators at SBU. The technology development and commercialization process begins with you, the faculty, postdocs, and graduate students that conduct the fantastic research that forms the basis of new technology disclosures, intellectual property, licenses, and yes, startups, as you will hear today. As a step towards engaging and developing our innovation community, IPP has partnered closely with Stony Brook's chapter of the National Academy of Inventors. SBU's NAI chapter mission, in part, is to foster a community of innovators and to encourage IP disclosure. So it's a natural fit with IPP. So together, we are very happy to present to you this terrific panel focused on faculty entrepreneurship. Becoming an entrepreneur is not easy. In fact, it's daunting. For a faculty with research, teaching, clinical, and administrative responsibilities, it's even more daunting. However, it can be done, and today we have 5 wonderful panelists who have taken the leap and will share their experiences with us today. They're all at all different stages of their journeys, and hopefully there are some points from today's panel that you could take away to make your own journey a little easier. This may be new connections, campus resources such as our office, IPP, or simply finding some inspiration to form your own startup. So a couple of housekeeping matters. We will leave time for questions at the end of the event. If you have a question, you can post it in the Q&A section on Zoom, and we will try to get to them at the end. If you see a question that you like from another attendee, you can give it a thumbs up in the Q&A section, and it will move up in priority, so it will be more likely to be answered provided we have time. So before we get started, I'd like to offer a big thanks to those who worked tirelessly in the background to help this event become possible. That's Tony Fabrizio, Olga Kaufman, Kathleen Farrell, Maureen Case, and Donna Tuminello. Thank you all for your hard work to bring this together. I'd also like to thank our panelists in advance for sharing their experiences with us today. And before I introduce our moderator, I'd like to pass the virtual podium to Rich Reeder, Dr. Rich Reeder, Vice President for Research at Stony Brook University, to make a few brief opening remarks. Dr. Reeder.
Thanks, Sean. Let me offer my welcome to all of those viewing the panel discussion today. Some of you know this is a continuation of a series of workshops that our Intellectual Property Partners group is hosting together with the Stony Brook chapter for the National Academy of Inventors. So the goal of these workshops is to advance a culture of innovation and entrepreneurship across the university. Some of you may recall the last panel focused on cultivating industry partnerships. And today it's a different topic, from ideas to startups, as Sean has just introduced. And I'd also like to thank IPP and the NAI for organizing this. I know a lot of work goes into this, and I know it'll be successful. So the inspiration for today's panel really comes from the knowledge that much of the creativity among our faculty and students has the potential to benefit society. Yet only a small portion of those innovations achieve that goal and make it to the marketplace. It's often the case that someone has an idea, but doesn't know how to take the next step and develop it into a successful product or service. That's where we can help. That's where our IPP team can come into play They have the expertise to guide innovators, just as you've heard Sean explain. We have many examples here at Stony Brook of faculty successfully creating startup companies, and I can mention a few such as Codagenics, QNECT, and Cornerstone Pharmaceuticals, which is now Raphael Pharmaceutics. So for today's panel, as you've heard, we're fortunate to have a number of very accomplished Stony Brook faculty who founded companies themselves. So let me offer my thanks to all of the panelists today, because I know you'll be sharing your experiences and your advice. I'm also very pleased that we have David Hamilton, the Executive Director of the Clean Energy Business Incubator Program, as our moderator today. Before I turn this back to Sean, let me also take this opportunity to let you know about the next workshop coming up. So as you'll see on the screen here, this colloquium, which is organized by IPP, will be held on January 25th next year. And the title, as you can see, is Female Perspectives on Entrepreneurship and Research. That panel will explore why there are far fewer female academic entrepreneurs, identifying barriers and stressing the importance of mentoring and role models. And as you can see, we have 6 very accomplished presenters from across the globe, including the director of the Eastern Regional Outreach Team from the US Patent Office. So please plan on joining us for that. And with that, let me turn this back to Sean.
Thank you, Dr. Reeder. So now I'd like to introduce our moderator for this afternoon's panel, David Hamilton. So David is no stranger to the startup community at SBU or to the region. He wears many hats. He's the executive director for the Clean Energy Business Incubator Program, CEBIP. He's the chief operating officer for the Advanced Energy Research and Technology Center here at Stony Brook. His education includes a BS in electrical and computer engineering from Clarkson University and an MBA in marketing from Hofstra University. He brings a focus in clean energy technologies with experience in business development, commercialization of engineering technologies, marketing and sales, and as well as the ability to communicate well with early stage entrepreneurs in the clean energy arena. David started his professional career with the Long Island Lighting Company, managing independent power producers. From there, he's been involved in the design, development, and implementation of Sirius satellite radio's terrestrial transmitters, developing sales and marketing plans for aerospace and IT companies, managing the sales and operation of hydrogen fuel cells for Plug Power, and most recently, developing the commercial sales and marketing for mPower Solar, a leading Long Island turnkey solar provider. So I'd like to hand it over to David. Thank you, David.
Great, thanks, Sean. Appreciate that. Shows you how long I've been around. I work for Lilco. Probably a lot of you in the audience don't even know what Lilco is anymore. There's been like 14 different variations of utilities since then. So, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here today. I'm looking forward to the conversation. As Sean said, being a researcher is hard. Obtaining a research grant is hard. Doing the research is hard. Entrepreneurship is hard. Starting a business is hard. But trying to do all those things at the same time, that's really, really hard. As Sean has said, I've had the honor of running the Clean Energy Business Incubator Program, as well as the Advanced Energy Center. In these roles, I've had the opportunity to see all sides of the complicated dance that an entrepreneurial researcher needs to do. At CEBIP, I have worked with several SBU researchers over the years who are hoping to take their tech into the market. It hasn't always worked out well. Not because they did something wrong, but because of all the other responsibilities that they had. At the Energy Center, I get to watch the greatness of the research mind in action. They're identifying problems and looking for solutions. However, when it comes to commercializing the technology developed in the center, the end results aren't always there. A researcher needs to teach, needs to get grants, needs to publish. So finding the time to run a business isn't easy. And it's not always a priority based on what's going on in their lives or what their commitments are. So it takes a very special individual to be able to do everything that's needed. So today we have the chance to speak with 5 impressive individuals from Stony Brook that do all of these things day in and day out, and they do them very, very well. So let's meet them quickly, and then we'll dive into a deeper discussion with everybody. So Nicole, let's start with you. Just a brief intro of who you are.
I'm Nicole Sampson. I'm here because I'm in the Department of Chemistry at Stony Brook with a lab in chemical biology, and I'll talk more later about how I ended up in the technology piece. And I'm also at the same time Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, so overseeing a very large college academic affairs.
Great, thanks, Nicole. Clint?
My name is Clint Rubin. I'm a professor of bioengineering. I also serve as director for the Center for Biotechnology and had the good fortune to be the founder or co-founder of several bio-based companies. And I think what has driven me in this regard is the old cliche that all of the bio-based scientists are interested in is this bench to bedside. I would argue that there's no way you can go from bench to bedside without involving the commercial sector. And I've had great fun trying to do exactly that.
Great, thanks, Clint. Jing Fan?
Good afternoon. My name is Jingfan Zhu. I'm a professor in the Department of Pathology. I'm also a program leader in the Stony Brook Cancer Center. And I'll tell you briefly later on about our technology. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Chioma?
All right, thank you all for coming to listen to our experiences. My name is Chioma Okeoma from the Department of Pharmacology. I am an associate professor here, and my lab works on both HIV and breast cancer, and we will talk more later on about the technology that we are involved in.
Great, thank you. And last but definitely not least is the one individual here that I've had the opportunity to work with for the last couple of years, Devinder Mahajan.
Thanks, Dave. Devendra Mahajan. I'm a professor of chemical and molecular engineering. But in addition to that, where this is relevant is, so 4 years ago, we also established an Institute of Gas Innovation and Technology in the Advanced Energy Center, and that's where I interviewed with David. And you're going to hear a little bit more about the company during the discussion. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Devinder. All right, so let's learn more about each of you and what your efforts are. So just for the audience, what we're looking to do here today is some of these questions everyone's going to answer because it's important for you to hear everybody's story. And then we do have some questions specific for the individual. So we're going to bounce around a little bit, but we want to make sure everyone has the opportunity to tell you all their stories as completely as possible. So with that, let's go in the same order, starting with Nicole. Just why don't you tell us about your startup, your technology, the pain you're looking to solve in the market, who you think your customers are, you know, that classic elevator pitch that you've got to learn to give to people. Why don't we start with that?
Right, so the company that I'm part of is Kronos Pharmaceuticals. We're working on 2 different types of diagnostics for very difficult to diagnose infectious disease that are non-invasive. One's low tech and one's high tech. The low tech arena is for pediatric tuberculosis, and the gold standard for tuberculosis diagnosis is to produce sputum and culture it and wait 3 weeks and see if bacteria grow. I think as we've all been living through a pandemic, we know that is a very unsatisfactory way to diagnose disease and know what you have when the disease is very infectious. In children, they don't produce sputum, so it's even more difficult. So our technology is based around an antibody serum. So collecting blood is considered a lot less invasive than trying to cough up deep from your lungs. On the high-tech side, the technology is focused on bacterial infections of bone, osteomyelitis, heart valves, infective endocarditis, and prosthetic joints. And the current technologies have a very difficult time, in fact, they don't distinguish between inflammation and infection. And so it's very hard in the clinic to know when to use antibiotics, and you can end up with all sorts of broad spectrum antibiotic use that causes secondary problems. So the technology is a PET radio imaging tracer that is specific for infection. So both of these technologies, the market is actually very specific and a little unusual, right? When it's a radiopharmaceutical, it's not just something that you store on the shelf. It has an actual half-life that's very short, on the order of a day or less, in which it has to be used. So the market there is really working through distribution networks rather than the ultimate end user or clinician. And that's also true in the tuberculosis infectious disease arena. So with that, I'll stop and turn it back over to you, Dave.
Great, thanks. Clint?
Thanks. I've been involved with 4 startups, starting early on, actually arriving at Stony Brook, forming a company called Exogen that had the good fortune of actually going through all phases of funding and ultimately went public and then was bought in sort of a hostile takeover by Smith and Nephew. The focus of that was a low intensity ultrasound-based device for the acceleration of fresh fracture healing that received an FDA approval. It was the first FDA approval for a medical device to accelerate fracture healing. So in that case, went through all these sort of iterations of getting funding from being a startup to a mid-stage to going public and all of the somersaults you do with that. And then finally being at the bruising end of a takeover. Since then, 3 other startups, one of which was purchased about almost exactly 10 years ago. Then another startup that is actually being manufacturing is going on in Europe. This is a device to treat osteoporosis. It's based on, not unlike Exogen, it is a device that uses mechanical signals to influence clinical outcomes. And then right now we're in the final throes of writing an SBIR grant that's due in about a week or so with a startup that IPP has helped us form. So thank you to Sean and Valerie in IPP, which is a using mechanical signals again. I guess I'm a hammer always looking for a nail. Using mechanical signals to influence T-cell proliferation rates to reduce vein-to-vein time in autologous cell therapy. So a common theme being mechanical signals, physical signals throughout to influence clinical outcomes, but then differences from everything from hopefully an SBIR funded NewCo to a company that went public.
Great, thanks, Clint. Jingfeng?
Thanks, Dave. So we started a company called Curamere Therapeutics in 2019. That was based on a platform, cancer drug development platform developed in our lab. And the technology is basically a regulatory small RNA-based cancer drug development platform. The idea is to engineer the regulatory microRNA in a way that enhance their potency to be able to eliminate the resistant cancer cells, because we all know the treatment failure for all the current therapy is largely due to the resistant mechanism of all these cancer cells. And I think with our research effort, we were able to show that these multi-targeted microRNA has the profound impact on multiple targets, oncogenic targets, as well as pathways, signaling pathways. And hopefully we could shut down the survival mechanism of these tumor cells that's resistant to chemotherapy, radiation, and even CAR T therapy. Hopefully we could provide a long-term survival benefit to different disease groups with different tumor types, as well, impact, the quality of life of these patients. And you all, heard about this COVID vaccine. We all get this RNA-based vaccine. So the RNA is basically a viral messenger RNA technology, and our technology is not a so-called messenger RNA, but we're developing a regulatory RNA that shuts down the oncogenic, the bad proteins in the cancer cells. Basically, that's the technology. And the market is basically for all the hospitals, for potentially all the cancer patients. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Great, very ambitious. Thank you. Looking forward to learning more. Chioma.
All right, thank you, David. So I will talk about 2 different technologies, but my startup we initiated when I was at the University of Iowa. And that was around a host intrinsic protein that it functions as an anti-HIV protein. However, this protein is also an oncoprotein because its overexpression promotes breast tumor. And the good thing about this protein is that it is on the surface of most cells. And the extracellular domain of this protein is responsible for its oncogenic activities, and the protein it's really involved in drug-resistant triple-negative breast cancer. So that was how we got into the business of initiating a company or a startup to solve the pain of drug-resistant breast cancers. And what we did was to develop a peptide against this protein to target drug-resistant cancers, then moved to Stony Brook University. Here, we've succeeded in really developing this protein by changing the structure of the peptide so that it can specifically target cancer cells and not normal cells. And it does not target blood cells as well. So that is one pain that we want to solve. The other is on the part of extracellular vesicles, and this is developing a tool either for researchers that work in extracellular vesicles, and it doesn't matter the field you are in, whether you are in HIV, in cancer, or any other disease, you can use this tool to isolate pure extracellular vesicles. We are also working on a similar tool that would then be used at the bedside so that you can take just a little bit of fluid, any biofluid, urine, saliva, blood, and if you pass it through this tool, you should be able to look at the spectra of the vesicles that you are monitoring, and these vesicles are a kind of window into what is happening within the person. So you will be able to tell, for example, if this person is HIV infected or not through those vesicles. I'll stop here.
Great, thank you. Devinder.
Thanks, Dave. So if I really go back and look at where I got my interest from for really on the commercial side from research was really when I came from Brookhaven National Laboratory where I started my career. And at that time, one of the major issues for the oil and gas industry, where that was my research area, was they didn't know what to do with all these natural gas they were flaring. And of course, now we know that that is one of the biggest issues, that you just flare gas is not something you want to do for climate change. So at that time was not the climate change factor, but it was actually they were just flaring it and they didn't know what to do. And so we came up with a process to convert that, because problem with the gas is there's just too much volume, and how do you ship it where the people are? These things are in remote locations. So we basically came up with a modular process where you could actually turn that into economically turn into a shippable liquid that could then be easily transported in ships. That I think was the first wave of patents that were filed at Brookhaven National Lab. And that actually led to 2011, then a company that came actually and licensed that. And so, but as David said before, I was still not really thinking about from that perspective of commercializing it. So they were licensed, that's fine. But I did actually at that point was a lot of demand for consulting. So I was getting a lot of contracts for consulting. And that actually then led to a small company that is established, but that was primarily a consulting company. But after this company acquired, they actually contacted me. And then I think after a little bit of by that time, by the way, I had moved to Stony Brook. And in 2017, those patents were actually the US DOE headquarters. They actually transferred the patents to me. And that actually was the basis for setting up Xanthine 17, that the company that is listed in this for this panel. When I look at these, instead of opening, so my model is a little bit different. instead of opening up 5 different companies, I think what has happened is Xanthing actually holds a portfolio of patents. As I said, multiple patents actually have been from USDO that have been given to the company. But in addition to that, when I came to Stony Brook, we actually continued some research which transferred later on to renewables. And then the biggest issue here was, if you don't know this, sulfur is the biggest culprit. If anybody has gone near the landfills, what do you think the smell is? From sulfur, H2S, hydrosulfide. So one of the biggest thing was how to remove sulfur. So one of the patents actually that we have exclusive license now is how to remove sulfur economically from the landfill gases, and not only just landfill, any gas that has sulfur. So that's one of there are series of patents on that from Stony Brook that are now exclusively licensed. And then after that, while we are doing that, if you know a little bit about the shale gas revolution that took place for the last 20 years in the United States, one of the biggest problems they have is they produce water. A lot of water is produced, and they don't know what to do with it after it's produced. I mean, wastewater. So we actually we had a grant from DOE for a long time on another grant, and that actually translated into developing a one-step process for cleaning wastewater. And that's the second patent actually. It's only about 2 years ago when we filed that patent, and that actually also is exclusive licensed now to Xanthing 17. So if I look at the model, it's not the number of companies. I only had one, Genol, that was my consulting company. But then when I got into this 2017, the real business of looking into going to the commercial sector, it's only one company with 3 different technologies. And as they grow, they probably spin off later. But at this point, that's how I'm dealing with the IP and what this Xanthing is doing at this point. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Devinder. So I think, you know, it's good that we get a sense of all the technology that's involved, right? You guys are all researchers. You've got solid technology that you're building this around, but you all could have continued doing research and getting grants, and yet you decided to take the leap. So what I think the audience probably really want to find out about is, you know, what were the circumstances that led up to your decision to form your current startup? You know, why did you decide to take that leap? What was the motivation to do it? And, you know, did you identify business partners in advance, or other entrepreneurial leads or mentors, or, you know, did you go about it on your own? So maybe a little bit about the background of why. So why don't we start with Jingfang?
Thanks, Dave. My motivations to start a company is driven by, you know, the motivation of develop a new drug that hopefully benefit cancer patients, because you know, we all have you know, friends, perhaps relatives who had cancer, and really need new medicine, and there is an urgent need to have that. And although the discovery, you know, academic research exciting and fun to make new discoveries, and we all have an eye on the end goal is basically find something that's useful that impact patient care. And that's basically the motivation of starting a company, so that we could really translate the discovery to a medicine that can be marketed to the patients. And yeah, I think that's all I have to say. Thank you.
No, absolutely. You're welcome. Chioma.
Yeah, so similar to what the last speaker said, my motivation was really around the science itself. I will use the protein that we are working on as an example. So I am a virologist by training, and I researched this protein as a very good antiviral protein. And a lot of my colleagues are looking at it. How can we use this to kind of inhibit HIV replication and all that? But then when I look at the cell biology aspect of this protein, and we continued to research, I discovered this protein is not really as good as a virologist will look at it. So I got into cancer research. So looking into cancer research, then I realized, wow, this protein does more than anybody can think of. And taking it on the other side of my career, why are you bringing bad news to us and stuff like that? You really couldn't stop. So as we are looking at the research end of it, we realized that this protein could really be very important in terms of cancer. And that was what drove me into starting a company to see if there's a way we can partner with people and develop a compound around this protein. And the compound is a compound that can inhibit the activity of this protein, so that if you restrict its oncogenic activities, what else can we do to allow it to function as an innate immunity protein against viruses? In as much as academic research is important and getting grants for that is also important, there are things that you want to do in terms of development that may not really be funded via just academic exercise. And that was what got me into it. I will stop here. I'm not going to talk about the other technology because it's kind of a similar situation too.
Great, thank you. Yeah, and having a the personal reason and the ability to get it that last mile is a very good reason to do it. Devinder, you touched on it a little bit, but why are there any personal reasons behind why you decided to take this venture? You explained the reasons you did the research, but why did you form the company?
Yes, good point. In my case, actually, was a sense of frustration, and what I mean by that is that. I told you that these companies were coming in and they were licensing the patents. Okay, I was getting my share of royalty under the Dole by Act. That's not a problem. But one thing I was realizing was they were calling me all the time, and they're saying, "Oh, we had to make a present to investors. Can you just join us?" And the problem I think there was that they were actually they didn't have the first-hand information, and they had a second-hand information, and they were always reaching back to me. I think that's what I mean by, for me, it was a sense of frustration that they didn't even know what they're talking about in the sense of overall picture. So how is it going to go anywhere faster? And especially all these technologies that I'm talking about, we have a looming climate change issue. And unless these things are deployed faster, we're not solving any problems. We are just defining the problem of climate change. We are not deploying technology to solve the problem. So I think that was the sense of frustration I'm talking about that led me to actually then 2017 form the Zenthing 17. And that is why you see now this is moving where it should be moving. Not at the pace I would like to see, but it is moving.
Understood. Absolutely. Nicole?
Thanks, Dave. Our story is a little different. I actually did not found the company, but I was one of the partners and officers. It was a company startup founded when one of my colleagues, collaborator who worked in Big Pharma, they had a good collaboration going, and then Big Pharma shut down the infectious disease division. So they thought that they would start a company together, and I got involved as an officer to sort of spin out some of those ideas and keep that going as a platform technology. So Devinder described how his company was set up sort of with a portfolio. That was the original vision, to sort of have different pieces that you could then spin out a fraction of the company and license it in one direction and another fraction in another direction. A few failed STTR grants and venture capital and angel conversations, and it sort of went silent. And then thanks to the NIH REACH grant that Clint Rubin has really shepherded through Stony Brook, I got internal monies through the REACH grant for some of the IP from my lab. And through all of that mentoring and those steps, I thought, well, what the hell, excuse me, why not use this company to try to get some of that easy grant money, Dave, that you've alluded to, which is through the STTR process. Turns out that, the pay lines for phase 1 can be quite generous. So it's a lot of work. And it has been very productive, I think, in terms of non-diluted funding and keeping science moving. But there's a lot of pieces that we can talk about later in terms of managing the company. So I've been involved in it, both as sort of the PI on the academic PI and the STTRs, having students work in that, or postdocs rather, coming out of the REACH program with that mentoring. So that was part of the motivation there. But I want to just finish with reiterating a point that a couple of other people have said, and this is something I learned through being involved with patent litigation. So once a product's really, really successful, it can take decades to really move ideas all the way forward, particularly on the bio drug side of things. And so it really takes that passion that you're hearing here and belief in the science that you're doing to keep it moving forward through thick and thin. And so that's the driving motivation behind, I think, a lot of us.
Great, thank you. Clint?
Great, thanks. Let me, I was going to use the word frustration, but Devinder already chose that one. So I'll go with being completely naive is really what sort of first motivated me into the entrepreneurial spectrum. And that is, so the meetings I go to are sort of orthopedic based or bone based, where you have Eli Lilly and Merck with these big, huge booths and these flashy, glossy posters, and orthopedic companies, Smith & Nephew or Howmedica, again, with big booths. And there we are as scientists sitting with our little posters, walking and, sort of hoarding cheese and cheese plates. And I sort of wondered if my science could actually translate to the clinical sector, and sort of went to one of these booths and spoke to some people on the commercial side. And the first thing they asked me is, well, do you have intellectual property? And I said, intellectual property, what is that? And then went back to the university and secured with, again, the help, I think it was not even OTLIR at that point, but some iteration before that, helped me secure intellectual property, and went back to these companies. They said, oh, no, we don't really do that. There's no real sort of niche for that sort of technology. And then again, with the help of the university side of the equation, we figured out that the only way to bring this to market is to start a company. So it was out of frustration and naivete and these sorts of things, where we found that the only way to bring a really novel, in my case, medical device out into the real world was to raise capital around it, rather than to license into a company that sort of found that they were allergic to it anyway. I'd say, like all the people on this panelist, I'm sure the great majority of people listening, we're all very passionate about our science. To bring it into the commercial sector is, I would describe it as being alien territory to most academics, myself included. And to learn the language of intellectual property, of market niche, of indications, et cetera, is something where having people help you understand that path, for me, was absolutely critical. And it was through these discussions that I found early stage investors at each of the companies that I have founded. So I would say that I remain naive, blissfully so, but that it is through collaborations with people who know the commercial sector and have connections to people, as Nicole points out, angel investors or Series A people, or even with Wall Street, that these sort of connections are essential to move your ideas past sort of the hope to stage into the tangible real stage.
Absolutely, thank you for that. And I found the theme that all of you had, which I think is fascinating, is, it's not I want to be an entrepreneur. It's not I want to make a bunch of money. It's the greater good. You're passionate about your tech, and you're frustrated that the existing mechanisms can't get it out there. So if they can't do it, I'm going to do it myself, because it's so important that it needs to be out there, and that's inspiring. So thank you for that. But in a similar vein, the last kind of question about your company and the formation of it, I'm assuming in our audience today, we have a lot of researchers that are considering this leap. And they don't know what their role would be, what they would do, and how they would do it. So, Nicole, you kind of touched on this. So I'm going to start with you, and then we'll go through the panel again. What your role is now, what led you to decide to take that role, and has it changed? Did you start off something different? Do you anticipate it being something different? How do you see your role moving forward in this?
Ooh. Right. So my role has been, it's a startup. So you're doing everything, right? It's not a bigger company when you're getting off the ground. My role in the background, and I want to just say, I always have appreciated our sponsored programs office, but I appreciate them even more now because when you're doing a startup with STTR or SBIR grants, you're also being your whole grants office communicating with NIH or DOE or NSF or whomever, maintaining compliance. And it turns out the federal government's rules are stricter than even venture capitalists' rules. So there's a lot of just managing day to day what you're doing, right? Getting insurance, paying rent. I see there's a question about the Stony Brook Incubator that we can come back to. You're your own HR department. You've got potentially safety rules and things to worry about. So that's always been part of my role. Some of it was carried by another partner in the business for a while. In addition to the research side of identifying the people to keep the research moving and to put in the grants. So our company has stayed focused the last 3 years on STTR type funding. One of the phase ones is close to moving into a phase 2. And so that will be a real pivot point for us. So did I answer your question there? I think I covered it. I mean, maybe the point to make is there are a lot of resources on campus and there are a lot of people around in terms of mentorship to really mentor you through what you need to do at various stages of the way. And if you don't do those informational interviews, it'll never happen.
Yeah, agreed. And I think we'll touch base on the resources that Stony Brook has and how they can help. If I can just ask you one quick follow-up question though, to put you on the spot. Do you see your role as leading this company for the next 5, 10, 15 years? Or do you see it getting to a certain point and then you'll take your little bit of equity or whatever it is and you'll go off and do other things? And for the rest of the panel, think about that as well, because again, that's a longer term vision that researchers struggle with when they're trying to figure out, what they want to do with the rest of their lives.
Yeah, when I figure out what I want to do with the rest of my life, I'll let you know.
Okay.
I see my role is staying focused on the science. I do not want to be the CEO of this company. I think there are better people out there to be CEOs. That's something we should come back to because I think that's one of the real gaps in the Long Island, actually New York area, is finding local part-time CEOs to help these startups. It's a very different level than further up once you've raised Series A or Series B. Who gets involved and how they get involved in the partnership of the company. So my goal is not to be the CEO. My goal is to see the science move forward. And as I mentioned, postdocs have worked in this company. So that's been the real success part, is a lot of the former students and postdocs moving through the company and getting a real pharma business background that's helped their careers.
No, a lot of great nuggets in there. Hopefully we'll be able to unwrap some of those. Devinder.
Okay, so I think what I started with, I said, I got involved because of sense of frustration. And because of that, I think you can pretty much imagine at this point, what I see is that this is a very crucial stage for the business. So therefore, it does need my attention. So that it can actually go to a point where it can then move forward comfortably. So I see definitely that in the next 2 years, I'm talking the scale, the time scale, because that can be 10 years because otherwise I'm in the same mode as people I just said. They're frustrated me. So it has to be in the next 2 years that this thing moves forward to a point where then the big investors can come in and we start the real stuff. deployment. One thing I do want to point out is that one thing in the last 2-3 years, what I'm finding out is for every technology, you have heard the word of valley of death. And this is a problem because anybody who says, okay, is everything worked out? I'm ready to invest. Well, if everything's worked out, no reason for you to invest. I'm pretty sure everybody's ready to invest. So there's a high risk period. So that would mean that where do you go for that? And I think that is where Nicole pointed out, I think about STTR, SPIR. I think those probably the safest routes because at least you are not giving away all your IP, 80% of it already before you even get somewhere. So I think that is where the high risk part is. And if you can overcome that during that period by SBIR phase 1 or STTR phase 1, phase 2, I think you get in a very comfortable position. And I think at that point, I'll probably make a decision what role I would play. But prior to that, I am paying a lot of attention to this at this point to get it off the ground.
Great, thank you. So Clint, what's your role right now in your current startup, and where do you see it going?
My current startup, I'd say it is getting the coffee, buying the donuts, writing the grant. I mean, it is a hoped for company. I mean, it's literally still on paper stages. Again, Stony Brook has been incredibly helpful in creating a platform to launch this. I would say that we have secured IP and provisional IP and even disclosures around it. And I would say that IPP, the group of that, has actually evolved quite markedly over the decades I've been at Stony Brook, where I find them to be actually encouraging the idea of exploring startups rather than necessarily just by reflex licensing technology. I'm very appreciative of that. But I would say that in thinking about my past experience with raising capital around companies, Series A or major investors, it goes back to the cliche we all know about real estate, which is location, location, location. I would say in the startup, in the bio-based startup, it's management, management, management. And in that sense, it is true that your technology and your indications, the maturity, at what level you have data, if it's preclinical animal data, or you have early stage clinical data. I mean, that certainly is reducing risk, and that makes it more valuable. But the reality is, at least my sense of reality is, that nobody other than friends and family is going to write you a check for $10 or $20 million if I'm going to be also still a professor at Stony Brook, which I don't anticipate giving up anytime soon. So you need experienced CEOs to come in, take this over, and move it forward. You could be the greatest scientist in the world, and maybe that great scientist is here listening in, but Wall Street or venture companies aren't going to give you the money. There needs to be management infrastructure with a business plan that's well thought out. Science in and of itself will not drive the engine. There has to be science in business with a commercialization plan. So right now, my goal, like Nicole, is to hopefully get some funding, to get this some momentum, get some fuel for this technology engine to move forward. But if then it comes to a point where the company gets taken over or it swells up and is running on its own steam, that's a wonderful thing. I would have to say it's not been about the money for me. I'm not suggesting it is for anyone on this call. But the reality is, to bring your technology forward and to grow your business, you need people who know what they're doing before money will be sent your way.
Yeah, I agree with that. All the companies that we work with, the investors like the tech, but they're investing in the team, and that's what they look at. So that's very valid. Thanks, Clint. Jingfeng, what's your role in your company right now?
Thanks, Dave. So I started the company in 2019, and I echo with Nicole. We actually crossed the Death Valley with the REACH Fund that allow us to not only file the patent, actually prove, make the critical proof of concept for the technology to minimize the risk. So we're able to not only found the company, but also managed to get the Series A funding. Drug development is a multi-billion-dollar, multi-year business, high risk, and no one wants to chip in that big chunk of money unless you have all those critical pieces that Clint just mentioned. And so we were lucky to get the $10 million Series A funding right in the beginning. I think this is really the fast way to move a company forward, at least for a drug development company. And we managed to get the best team that's recognized by the investment world. And my role initially is just scientific co-founder, and I'll continue to do discovery here at Stony Brook as part of the company's sort of a discovery arm. So not only benefit the company, but also benefit the IP repertoire for Stony Brook. So we'll continue to build IP, intellectual property here on campus, and that will benefit the university and also benefit the company in the long run. And my long-term role will be still in academia. I won't be able to jump over to the commercial side as a president or CEO because I have no experience whatsoever. And there's so many people that are way better than me. And I'll basically, if I do that, I'll imagine myself jump into the ocean with all the sharks around. I'll be swallowed in 1 second. So there's no way. And so I'll do what I can do in academia lab and enjoy the discovery. That's all I can do. I'm not worried about the dilutions, whatever, someone take over down the road. That's something not for me to worry because I have enough worry already with the grants and students.
No, absolutely. I think the key point there for the audience is, this is your baby and your baby is beautiful and you don't think that anybody can do it better than you. But if you really want to have a successful company, more often than not, you have to get it to a certain point and then you have to hand it off to the person who could take it to the next level. And if you go into that and you understand that, you have a better chance of being successful and your company succeeding. So Chioma, what about you?
All right, so I'm gonna kind of step back a little bit for the audience that are watching, because for me, I really had no idea what role I'm gonna play. So I took a completely different route, and that is the NSF I-Corps. So participating in NSF I-Corps, they taught us the language and gave us direction. And that was what helped me understand I can do what I do best, which is do the science, find a business mentor, because I knew nothing about business. It doesn't even interest me. And then work with technology transfer office, and this was at the University of Iowa anyway, and find an entrepreneurial lead, someone that knows everything about how to manage a company and all that. So my job has always been do the science, direct on the science, and also look for funds. So we now have about 2 provisional patents and working toward getting funding to then move the startup company to a completely different phase. But what would I like to do in the future? I will still continue with science. I do not like business. I just have to say it. So if I invent ideas, mentor people, groom people toward that, then I would like to have other people that know what they are doing manage the business side of it. And that's what I would love to do.
No, that's and it's good. It's good to understand that going in, and hopefully we'll talk about it later. Stony Brook has a lot of resources to help you find those people to work with you. One last quick thing, Clint, I want to jump back to you. You know, this is your fourth company. You've been doing it for a little while. Have you noticed anything different this time around? You know, is the ecosystem different? Are you approaching things differently, or is it the same old slog for the fourth time?
I think it's been certainly a learning experience for me, and if the landscape has changed or hasn't changed, I'm not sure. I'm sensitive to it in the sense that each time that I have started a company, my goals have been a little bit different, and I've sort of knew more going in the second time than I did the first time, the third time more than the second time. I would say that the struggle I've had dealing with investors or dealing with corporate partners has been the definition of what is early. I think Devinder raised the issue of this valley of death. But the valley of death to big pharma is different than it is to mid-stage biotech, is different than it is to a Series A investor, and it's certainly different than it is to an SBIR, STTR study panel. So I think that it has been my perceived notion of understanding what my data are actually saying relative to a specific clinical indication that has sort of helped me forge out a path forward. And so, for example, what I'm doing right now in collaboration with my academic colleague, Eti Chan, and my business colleague, Mike Bielski, is the entrepreneur, and also certainly being helped forward with the IPP people and also the incubator as well. It's been this sort of primordial soup that is mixing together, and I think it's sort of coming together now where I understand the path forward with the incubator, with the intellectual property, with the relationship with an outside business, with the application for an SBIR and our academic relationship to that SBIR. So I'd say that long answer to your short question has been that understand the moving parts a little more robustly than I did 30 years or so ago. And I think that my patience has sort of changed, mainly because in the first two startups, tangling with people who were looking for payouts was not really what I was in it for. I wanted to see the technology help people move through disease or injury. And that's very different than a really big time investment community who wants to see in your business plan what an exit strategy is. And I still have trouble defining what an exit strategy is. So long non-answer to your very short specific question.
No, I mean, it's a great answer. You know, it's a confusing process, even for someone who's done it a couple times. It's not cookie cutter. It's not easy. Everything is different. Yeah, and the role of investors is challenging because you want to find the altruistic investor that'll give you money and let you do your thing. But push comes to shove, they want their 10x return within 5 years. Even the really good ones want that, and so that is challenging. So Clint, thank you. So actually, that brings us very nicely to the next part of the session that I wanted to dive into a little deeper, because it's really critical, is funding. You've all mentioned funding in different shapes and forms. But I wanted to focus a little bit on the fact that most SBU researchers, in my opinion, are going to go for that grant funding first, right? They got grant funding for their research, and then when they try to spin out a company or whatever it may be, they're probably going to look at grant funding. So Nicole and Chioma, I think both of you have looked at grant funding as the initial way of raising money. So focusing on you two, I'm curious, how you found your opportunities, how you went about applying for the grants. Did you write them to yourselves? Did you hire somebody? Did you use some, how did you do that? And what successes and failures have you had so far? So Chioma, let's start with you on that.
All right, so I will use my tools technology as an example. That came through my arrow one, meaning the ideas came through the arrow one, and it was executing the aims of that arrow one that kind of revealed a pain in the field. And because of that, I said, I'm gonna solve this pain in that field. And that led me to the path of developing a technology that we have right now. So the funding came from scientific research. We now have the tool. Now that we have the tool, the type of funding that I am pursuing, I have not written SBIR or STTR for this particular technology, but there's a grant that is called an R24. It is a 5-year resource award that can fund about 500,000 maximum a year. This is through NIAID. Because it is an HIV kind of linked, I tried to link it to HIV because the technology can be used for everything, but I am an HIV researcher linked it to HIV. So I've applied for this R24, got reviewed, scored, it wasn't successful, went back in. So now I am waiting for, crossing my fingers, hoping that the R24 gets funded. The difference between the R24 and the STTBIR is that the R24 is similar to an R01. So it is a 12-page grant, but you will have to write some pieces like the SBIR, STTR, but you do not have to have a company or spin anything out. It is strictly academic, but you own the IP or whatever you are getting from that company, you can patent that, you own the IP. It's not the government that owns the IP. So it's called a resource grant, R24. Some NIH institutes participate in this type of funding. So that's what we are doing. For the other technology, I've tried to get some SBIR, TTR. It has not worked out successfully, but I am hopeful that one of these days it would work. One of the drawbacks that we have in the peptide technology is that we moved from Iowa, and I think it's something we'll talk about later on, but human resources is a huge, huge thing when it comes to running a spin-off company, especially when you have other things. Who writes the grants? I write the grants, I write all my grants. Although there may be some resources out there, I've participated in, yes, one of the programs that the Office of Technology Transfer kind of had in the past. But other than that, I write all my grants.
Got it.
I hope I answered your question.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's a complicated process, and I think Sean and the IPP folks can help out a lot as well as they try to figure out the right paths. So Nicole, what about you? What have you been doing from that perspective?
Right, so we've relied on SBIRs and STTRs, and I know there's a question in the Q&A. One of the nice things about the STTR is that there's actually a requirement that the PI be in an academic institution. And so that's how a faculty member can walk that line. You don't even have to be the owner of the company. You're just a subcontract on the company's STTR grant. But before I even got to that point, in terms of the STTRs that I've written, first step actually was to talk to the program officers at NIH to see if this is something, there are specific program officers that have SBIRs, STTRs in their portfolios, and they're looking for specific things. They know what areas they're looking to fund their portfolio building as well. And so having those conversations are really essential. One of the key pieces of those conversations is going above the statutory limits on the level of funding. So you can actually ask for more money than the grant instructions say you can, because they all realize how expensive it is to do the research. And as long as you have program officer permission, you can ask for what you need up to like a higher cap. In terms of writing the actual grant, again, huge beneficiary of the resources at Stony Brook and the Center for Biotech. They have, I think they still do, a contract with BBC Consulting, who are sort of the masters of how to write these grants. And I've written and had funded a lot of NIH grants, and the style is different. The budget rules are different. So I have to admit, I was a little testy at sitting through their workshops and being lectured at, and 60% of it I knew, but the other 40% was absolutely critical for getting funded, because otherwise you would just make rookie mistakes. And then those mistakes get caught as you're trying to get funded on the backside and can cause you a lot of heartache. You know, when NIH decides it's gone through council that they're going to fund something, you have probably under 7 days to respond. And so if you don't have everything set up properly, you'll lose the money. So that's really having all, you know, accounting systems and all this stuff sort of poised is really important. Once you have your first one, it's a lot easier. So those are the two things. And while the third is having IP, intellectual property, at some stage. Otherwise, you're really not going to be eligible for that type of funding. So I answered a question in the chat box, and this is for Sean. You know, file your invention disclosures early and often. It starts the conversation and it puts the date on things, but the internal office will then start walking through it with you. And that's really important too, as they help you identify the gaps in what you have in your intellectual property portfolio.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you for that. And thanks for the plug for the BBC efforts. I know Clint and the BioCat have been running that. And Stony Brook recently got some funding from NISTAR to do some additional SBIR training. And we're going to work with BBC, and we're going to have more workshops, and we're going to provide some significant one-on-one writing help for folks. So it won't just be the lecture hitting you on the head, then they're going to sit down and help you write it. So, so everyone from the Stony Brook area, actually from the whole downstate region, look for some more information on that. So
if I could just jump in, just to say, Dave, I'm glad you reminded that. They were very structured, and it was a process of feedback that kept you on your toes. You have to make that commitment to. But yeah, really good point. We did that.
Great.
Week by week. This is what you do.
Can I add to that? So you're right, Stony Brook is continuing the SBIR STTR workshop with BBC in collaboration with David. And I have to say, like Nicole, I don't like being lectured to. I know that's shocking to people, but you do learn a lot from this workshop. And if you complete the workshop, you are eligible for one-on-one consulting. And I would say that Etty and I are at this very moment getting one-on-one consulting down to the wire from BBC to submit our SBIR. So it's, boy, talk about getting help submitting an SBIR, STTR, just unbelievably helpful.
Agreed. So, well, speaking of Eddie, so I want to dive into some questions from the audience now. I mean, I had a half dozen more questions, and I think this panel probably could have gone on for 4 hours, you know, but we've got around 15 minutes left. But we do have a question that came in the chat that was going to go to the next area I was going to touch on anyway. So I'll read it. It sounds like these entrepreneurship activities are actually accelerating the research rather than taking time away from your research. Given that SBU typically allows about 1 day per week for other work in addition to your school's obligations, do you find it enough to do the other company's stuff? So, I mean, that's a great question. And I think I'll open it up to anyone who wants to answer that. Anyone want to take a crack at that and get a couple answers? Clint?
Happy to start. I would say that, not speaking for anybody else, but for me, I think of the entrepreneurial activities as being an extension of what I'm trying to accomplish as a scientist rather than instead of. And so by that expansion process, I think that I'm trying to achieve these sort of clinical outcomes that my own science is targeted towards. So I don't think of it as I'm wearing a scientist hat and then I'm wearing an entrepreneurial hat, but I'm thinking of it as sort of like this Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde hybrid mix where I'm always thinking about both. So I don't think it's either or. It's figuring out how to manage your time. And yes, our union contracts give us 1 day per week to do consulting. But as Nicole points out, even with SBIR grants, 1/3 of the budget going towards the academic side, which is how we deal with submitting SBIR grants for the company, but still actually realizing an upside on the academic side, is you can fund aspects of it this way. And the ultimate goal for me is to have a successful company that can actually feed money back into the lab. A bit of a pipe dream that worked for a while there, but startups aren't in that position to do exactly that.
Great. All right. Who else? Nicole?
I would just add that, and I didn't say this earlier, that a lot of the STTRs from our company have been written by postdocs with mentorship by the PI. So and they become employees of the company. So it's really a path for them towards that further independence of writing proposals, taking advantage of all the mentoring through BBC, et cetera, we've talked about. And then it's their time commitment that's paid through those grants that's really keeping the day-to-day going.
Great. Yes, Joan.
So I will just take the last part of that question, finding time to do enough. I think the main thing is about prioritization. You got to know when things are due, what you are required to do, and then prioritize. Once you do that, you may be able to kind of catch up with everything that you have. But if you're not planning and prioritizing, it's not going to happen.
Great. All right. Why don't we actually? I have something that I want. It kind of follows up on Nicole, what you said. We are all from Stony Brook University. There are students here, and you guys are engaged with them. How have you engaged SBU students and postdocs in your startups? Are there challenges? Are there benefits? So Nicole, you mentioned part of it is, utilizing them on some of the grants, and then they become employees. So maybe I'll leave it to whoever wants to answer this. How do you utilize this great resource? Because no offense to all of you, you're all brilliant, but they're the ones that are doing a lot of the work and doing the heavy lifting and moving the ball forward. So how do you engage them, Clint?
I'd love to start on that one. I mean, just building on what Nicole pointed out, and this becomes a real career option for students, not only to get engaged in the startup community and understand what commercialization or market indication or clinical indications actually mean, which already is starting to make you a unique student. But if you are successful in SBR, STTR, or successful in raising capital, and the company actually becomes real, maybe goes to the incubator, goes over to the research and development park, I mean, this can become your very future. And let me just throw it. So we have doctoral students in our lab group have become authors of patents, are actually getting royalty payments right at this very moment. Thank you, Sean. And that's a wonderful thing as well. But to actually take your thesis work and build it into your future, I think is really an opportunity. And there's coursework out there, beyond an SBI or STR workshop, but actually like the Center for Biotech's Fundamentals of the Bioscience Industry, which deals with commercialization, is a chance for postdocs and grad students to understand the process better than we faculty do.
Great. Anybody else? Yeah, Nicole?
Yeah, I mean, Clint mentioned the course that I wanted to talk about, and I can just describe the avenue. Students, I think, are a little different than postdocs. Students, their theses have to be public, and so there are serious conflict the conflict rules that you need to follow are a little more detailed there in terms of it's challenging if the research they're doing isn't publishable, right? But the avenue that several students have taken is to go through that Frontiers course, graduate, and then become postdocs that then do the SBIR, right? Because then that becomes their next career step. So it's sort of walking the intellectual property through the thesis process to that patent filing stage that Clint was just talking about. And now the IP exists that you can take it to the next step. So that's probably the simplest route if you just think about where people are in their PhD careers, at what point they're ready to make that leap, et cetera. You know, there could be, it's not one size fits all, but I would suspect that that's probably the most general way that it can happen.
Great. Devinder.
Yeah, so having actually employed about 10 students over the past summer on various projects, I think let me say this. Students are obviously, as a faculty, we are here for that, to train students, right? But one of the things I find out is, number one, if you have to excite them what they're doing. Second, in addition to that, you can pay them also. That's a great help. So otherwise they'll be flipping hamburgers to make money in the summer, and that's not something they really want to do. So I think that has been a driving force here for the Gas Institute. We have right now a total of 21 students who are involved in various projects. And they are, the reason really they are involved is, initially, of course, they know they're going to get paid, but that is really not the reason anymore. They're actually excited what they're going to do, because they see that this is not just done for the sake of research. And these are, by the way, undergraduate students I'm talking about. They can actually make a difference with something that's going to go in the marketplace. So I think that those are the two intertwined things that are drawing the students, at least in the Energy Center in my group.
Great, thank you. And your students are very proactive and engaged in the Energy Center, and it's a thrill to see. So Paul has a question, and so I'll read Paul's question, then I'm going to expand on it a little bit. He goes, which of you have had startups in the Stony Brook incubators? Tell us about the costs and your experience. I'm going to expand that a little bit to what resources you've used at Stony Brook. IPP has gotten a lot of shout outs, so you can shout out again, and the BioCat as well. But you know, what Stony Brook resources have you used? Have you been in an incubator? As the incubator guy, you know, we're a great resource. So you know, whoever wants to answer that one, that'd be great. I'm going to call on somebody. There you go.
I'm happy to start. So many years ago, when Leidy first started, the incubator first started, we actually had lab space in there, which was important at that point, where the Research Foundation was sort of wondering about the status of intellectual property developed by a new co, who was actually the owner of that. And I think that Rich Reeder and Sean and Pete Donnelly have actually done a superb job being advocates for faculty and faculty startups and protecting intellectual property. But I would also say, maybe as a shout out to IPP again, that, you know, having the Research Foundation be the owner of intellectual property has actually helped us with credibility. Say, well, a university owns this is actually a good thing. But in terms of incubators, with this SBIR that's going in later this month, we have letters from the incubator that are describing both fluid space, sort of fillable shared space, both office and lab space, which is helpful because there has to be a footprint outside of the university for the SBIR. We were just on the phone this morning with Emin Cow with the manufacturing group over in Gyrodon, an R&D park, about match funding that they have to build up your manufacturing base. I think that access to core facilities when the university has been helped through OVPR. So I think I haven't run into any brick walls with this process. I mean, there's certainly things you need to navigate. Sometimes you need to go around, sometimes over, sometimes through, but nothing has been a hard stop for us in terms of resources from education, the SBIR, STTR programs, the help with IPP, with disclosures, provisionals, and supporting full patents, the connection and networking the Center for Biotech and IPP does to put you in touch with investors or potential entrepreneurs. For us, that's been a great resource, and we're grateful to certainly to Stony Brook for fostering this sense of community.
Anybody else have any thoughts on the ecosystem and incubation here on campus before we start wrapping things up? All right. I mean, I know Devinder has, he's got a strong presence at the Energy Center. He's been involved in some incubation programs, and I'll touch, if I have time, on some of the economic development programs. So for the audience that's out there, there are a lot of programs that can help on multiple ways: funding, mentoring, guidance, space, labs, etc. So, all right, we got around 5 minutes left. And I really wanted to toss it back to each of you, a minute less. We didn't have a chance to hit everything. If you guys have any concluding thoughts for our audience, again, our folks are looking to understand what it takes to come from the lab and go out into the real world, and you guys are all doing it. So I'll go across the board in my Brady Bunch box here. Devinder, final thoughts?
Sure. So let me, I was trying to unmute before, that's what it's saying, but in any case. So let me actually, what you were just alluding to before, from my personal experience, I think Stony Brook has given me a lot of freedom, both doing my research, which actually has expanded considerably in the last several years, but at the same time, really explore if something is useful is coming out that actually can go into the market. So in terms of the resources, and that's what I was trying to allude before, energy center space has been a great issue, of course, asset to sell outside, and number is a very, very sellable thing. And the second is, as you pointed out, well, Dave, yourself with your SPUR, as well as P. Donnelly and others who was from the SICE fundings. I think there's so many resources available inside that if you sit down actually and know these resources are there, you can actually really make a head start even without going outside for begging for money. I think, and that actually you cross over to the other side, and that's when you are actually ready. So there's no question between all the economic development as well as of course, our intellectual property partnership office, Donna, they have been extremely good to me in terms of trying to move this forward. So, if anybody wants to get into look into opening a company, I think Stony Brook is a great way to a place to start, and that's all I can say.
Great, appreciate it, Devinder. Clint.
I would say that if any take-home message I would try to emphasize to the people listening would be, don't do it alone. You know, I always go to one of my favorite poems, which is from the Divine Comedy, The Inferno. And you think of, you know, where Dante'd still be stuck on the second ring of the Inferno without Virgil. You know, we as faculty, we're good at science, we're good at basic and applied research. Commercialization is a different language, it's a different landscape. It's difficult to understand, and without networking and knowing people, it's hard to move forward. So I would say, don't try it alone.
Great, thanks, Clint. Chioma?
All right, so I will say, do not be afraid. Fear kind of keeps a lot of people away. If any of us can do it, anyone can do it. Just do not be afraid, follow your passion, and then find the right resources, both human resources and the regular resources that you need. Once you assemble these things and eliminate fear, do not think about how much work does it take to get all these things done. We have 24 hours in a day. If you manage yourself and your time very well and have the right resources, I believe you can make it. Thank you.
Thank you. Nicole.
I think in addition to having your passion, you should be prepared to put not a huge amount, but some of your own cash on the table to get it off the ground, just to pay that first bookkeeper, or you're gonna have to pay, maybe it's only $25 to BBC Consulting to be part of the workshop. But there are some legal costs there to get started. And you know, if the company's successful, it can be a loan to the company, you get it all back, maybe. But you do have to have some financial skin in the game.
Great, thank you. Jingfang.
Yeah, I echo with Kioma. It's a game of no guts, no glory. You really need to breathe yourself up and try it, because there's no other way. And we are all iron chefs. We think we can do everything, but it's not only take a village, but actually take a world of network to get this off the ground. So networking, and know any kind of brilliant people that you want to know, and not just scientists, but expand your network to commercialization, to venture capital, to anyone that you can have a connection, and you never know who may help you to get this thing going. And I noticed there's a question for international connection. It really take not only international connection for future clinical trials, multi-center, multinational, but also funding from other side of the world is also critical. So it literally take a world to get something done. And so, yeah, that's all.
No, that's great stuff. If I can summarize what I just heard, I mean, the pearls of wisdom in the last 5 minutes were crazy. Resources, read Dante, don't be afraid, don't go alone, skin in the game, no guts, no glory. There's an Iron Chef reference. So, you know, there's a lot of stuff that goes into being an entrepreneur. And, you know, so all the panelists, and I want to thank you all for sharing your stories. They're all inspirational, and there's a lot more to it. So thank you all for that. I want to wrap up with, I guess, 2 quick things. If there were any questions that we didn't answer, we're going to try to get back to you all with answers via email in some shape or form. So we'll try to get answers. Please reach out to me if you need anything moving forward. I can be a good conduit, as can Clint for the Center for Biotech, you know, but I can help get you folks into the right places. So the last part for me is, you know, as the economic development rep here, right, as the incubation guy, as the guy who is running the strategic partnership for industrial resurgence and involved in some of the other programs at Stony Brook, we have an incredibly robust support system here. We've got what Sean is doing, we have what Clint is doing, and we have multiple programs at economic development, and we're all geared to help you take this technology out of the lab and move it forward. Licensing, starting a company, getting you investors, helping you with grants, helping you with manufacturing, whatever it may be. So please use us, reach out, use this as a launch pad. If you're interested in doing this, we're all here to help. So with that, again, everyone, thank you very much. Audience, thank you very much. Hope you enjoyed it. Have a great rest of the day. Thank you.